From the water he was saved, through the fire he was called, and soon he would lead his people to freedom. This is the story of Moses, a story of faith, destiny, and divine purpose. Many years ago, in the land of Egypt, the children of Israel multiplied and grew strong, so strong that a new Pharaoh, one who did not know of Joseph, feared them. The king looked upon the people of Israel and said to his own, "They are too many and too mighty. If war comes, they may rise against us." So he devised a cruel plan to oppress them. The Egyptians forced the Israelites into hard labor, yet the more they worked, the stronger they grew. Pharaoh's fear deepened, and he gave a terrible order. Every newborn Hebrew boy must be thrown into the river. But one mother, Jochebed, could not bear to lose her son. For 3 months she hid him, and when she could no longer hide him, she placed him in a basket, covering it with tar to make it float. The river carried him away, but not beyond the reach of God's plan. His sister, Miriam, followed the basket at a distance, her heart watching over her brother. By the water's edge, Pharaoh's daughter found the baby boy. When she saw him, her heart softened and compassion filled her. "This must be one of the Hebrews' children," she said, and in that moment she chose to adopt him, naming him Moses, because he had been drawn out of the water. And so Moses grew, nurtured by his mother, but destined for a life in Pharaoh's court. As Moses grew, he could no longer ignore the suffering of his people. One day he witnessed an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave. In a moment of anger, Moses struck the Egyptian, ending his life. Fearful of the consequences, Moses fled Egypt and wandered into the desert of Midian, where he lived as a shepherd. It seemed that Moses' journey had ended, but in the quiet solitude of the wilderness, God had a greater plan waiting for him. And it was here in the silence of the desert that God called to him from the burning bush, saying, "Moses, Moses, I have seen the suffering of my people in Egypt. I will send you to Pharaoh to bring them out of bondage." Moses, once a prince of Egypt, now returned not as royalty, but as a messenger of God. He had encountered the Almighty in the burning bush and had been tasked with a monumental mission: to demand the release of the Israelites from Pharaoh's grasp. Moses stood before Pharaoh, his brother Aaron by his side. With a steady voice, Moses declared the message from God, "Let my people go." Pharaoh replied, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go." And Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he refused to listen. Instead of granting freedom, he increased the burden on the Israelites, ordering his taskmasters to make their labor even more unbearable. Moses' mission seemed impossible. The people blamed him for their worsening conditions, and Pharaoh refused to relent. But Moses did not give up, for God had promised deliverance. And so began the plagues. God sent signs and wonders upon the land of Egypt, starting with the Nile, the lifeblood of the nation, turning to blood. The water became undrinkable, and the fish died, but Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. Next came the plague of frogs. From the river, frogs swarmed every home, filling every corner of Egypt. Pharaoh, overwhelmed, begged Moses to pray to God to remove the frogs, promising to let the people go. But when the frogs were gone, Pharaoh hardened his heart once more. He broke his promise, and the people remained in bondage. God sent swarms of gnats rising from the dust and covering the land. Even Pharaoh's magicians admitted, "This is the finger of God." Yet still, Pharaoh would not listen. Then came the flies, filling the air, covering every surface. But in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, not a single fly could be found. God was making a distinction between his people and the Egyptians. Pharaoh relented, but only slightly. He offered to let the Israelites sacrifice to God, but only within Egypt. Moses refused, knowing that God had commanded them to leave Egypt entirely. Then the Lord struck down the livestock of the Egyptians, while the animals of the Israelites were spared. Still, Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Next came the hail, a storm so fierce it shattered everything in its path. Pharaoh, in fear, called for Moses once more, promising freedom. But again, when the storm ceased, Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Locusts came next, devouring everything the hail had left behind. Egypt was brought to the brink of famine, yet Pharaoh's heart remained hard. Then came a deep, unnatural darkness, covering the land for 3 days. No one in Egypt could see, and they did not move from their places. Yet in the homes of the Israelites there was light. But even this sign did not move Pharaoh. At last the final plague came, the death of every firstborn in Egypt. But God gave Moses a way to protect his people. The Israelites were instructed to sacrifice a lamb and mark their doorposts with its blood, so that the angel of death would pass over them. That night, the angel of death passed through Egypt. In every home without the blood of the lamb, the firstborn perished. Even Pharaoh's own son was not spared. Pharaoh, devastated by the death of his son, finally relents. Pharaoh spoke, "Go, leave my people, take your flocks and herds and be gone. Bless me also." And so, after years of suffering and 10 devastating plagues, Pharaoh let the Israelites go. They left Egypt in haste, carrying with them the treasures of the land, heading toward the promised land under the guidance of Moses and the hand of God. The Israelites, trapped between the advancing Egyptian army and the vast waters of the Red Sea, cried out in fear and despair. But Moses, their leader, stood firm, for God had promised deliverance. God commanded Moses to stretch out his hand over the sea, and in a miraculous moment, the waters parted, creating a dry path between 2 towering walls of water. The people of Israel hurried across the dry land, the waters rising high on either side, shielding them from the army that pursued. Though their hearts were weary from years of slavery, hope surged as they stepped closer to freedom. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened once again, and he sent his army in pursuit. Chariots and horsemen raced after the Israelites, seeking to bring them back into bondage. With a final motion, Moses stretched out his hand, and the sea returned to its full depth, engulfing the Egyptian army. Not a single chariot survived, and the Israelites stood in awe as the waters calmed and their enemies were no more. The people of Israel rejoiced, for God had delivered them from the hand of Pharaoh. They sang songs of praise, their voices echoing across the desert. The journey to freedom had begun. For more Bible stories, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Thank you.